A farmer ordered the demolition of a small chapel dedicated to the Virgin Mary that had stood on his property for over 40 years. In less than a week, the cattle began behaving in a way no veterinarian could explain. A miracle of the Virgin Mary that started with a decision and ended with a man on his knees in the dirt. Before we continue, share in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Let's see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary have reached. And if you haven't yet joined our family, subscribe now, because here, each day, we witness the tender love and mighty power of the Mother of God. His name was Thomas Harlan, 59 years old, owner of a cattle operation that had been in his family since the 1940s. Thomas rose before first light, checked water troughs, counted head, studied feed prices, and went to bed bone-tired. That rhythm had carried the ranch through droughts, market crashes, and the slow aging of the land itself. He inherited the place from his father, Raymond, who ran it for 35 years until a heart attack took him 6 years earlier. Before Raymond, it was Thomas's grandfather, Elias Harlan, the man who first broke the ground and built the fences with his own hands. Elias also built something else. In the far east corner of the property, where a stand of live oaks offered shade, he laid brick and stone for a tiny chapel barely 12 feet by 10. He finished it in the spring of 1982. Inside, he placed a hand-painted plaster statue of Our Lady of Grace, her hands open, her face gentle and steady. The chapel had no electricity, no pews, just a wooden kneeler Elias made himself and a small shelf for flowers when his wife could pick them. For more than 4 decades, the little structure stood untouched. Cattle grazed around it. Calves played in its shadow. Storms came and went. The roof held Thomas's mother, Clara, now 83, still lived in the main house. Every day, weather permitting, she walked the quarter-mile to the chapel. She carried her rosary beads in a worn cotton pouch and sat on the same low bench Raymond had nailed together for her years ago. She prayed slowly, bead by bead, sometimes aloud, sometimes in silence. Thomas never joined her. He respected the routine the way he respected her habit of baking cornbread on Sundays. He let it be. To him, the chapel belonged to Clara's world, not his. He dealt in weight-gain ratios, calf prices per pound, and fence post spacing. Faith was private, sentimental, something you kept in a drawer like old photographs. That changed the Sunday he decided the herd needed to grow. The east pasture held the best grass and the cleanest pond on the place. The chapel sat almost exactly in the middle of the expansion he had sketched on graph paper. He walked over to the main house after breakfast. Clara was washing dishes. Thomas sat at the table and spoke plainly. "Mom, I'm taking down the chapel." Clara set the plate down carefully. "Taking it down? I need that ground for more grazing. We're adding another 100 head next spring. The chapel sits right where the new cross fencing has to go. I'll get you a nice statue for the porch or the living room, whatever you want." Clara turned to face him fully. Her eyes were clear but tired. "Your grandfather built that chapel with his own hands. He built it so the Virgin would watch over this land and everyone on it. It's been here longer than most of the corrals." Thomas exhaled through his nose. "I know what it means to you, but this is business. The numbers don't lie. We need the space." Clara studied him for a long moment. "Thomas, I'm asking you. Please don't do this." He held her gaze, then looked away. "It's already decided." He stood and left the kitchen. The screen door slapped shut behind him. Monday morning, he gave the order. For hands, led by Roy, who had worked the ranch since Thomas was a boy, arrived with sledgehammers, pry bars, and a flatbed trailer. Roy hesitated at the gate. "You sure about this, boss?" Thomas nodded once. "Do it." They worked quickly. By noon, the walls were down, the roof beams stacked, the bricks piled in a heap. The plaster statue lay on its side among the rubble, undamaged. Clara watched from the kitchen window until the last stone fell. Then she drew the curtain and turned away. That evening, she did not come to supper. Thomas ate alone at the long table, the house quieter than usual, The next morning, Clara asked Roy to bring her the statue. He carried it gently to the porch, wrapped in an old saddle blanket. Clara wiped the dust away with a damp cloth and placed the figure on her dresser beside the window that looked toward the east pasture. Thomas said nothing when he saw it there. To him, the matter was closed. 3 days later, Thursday, Thomas rode out at first light to check the new layout. The east pasture lay open, green, inviting. No cattle grazed there. Not one. The herd had bunched tightly in the north and south pastures, standing shoulder to shoulder in spaces meant for half their number. Thomas frowned. He radioed the hands. They tried driving the animals across. The cattle walked to the open gate, then stopped. Hooves planted, heads low, eyes fixed on the empty ground ahead. Shouts, whips cracking in the air, even a truck horn. Nothing moved them forward. One steer took 3 steps inside, then backed out so fast he nearly knocked Roy down. Thomas dismounted, grabbed a halter on a gentle cow he had bottle-fed as a calf, and pulled. The animal followed until the gate line, then locked every leg. Thomas pulled harder. The cow leaned back, eyes wide, refusing to let go. The pasture looked perfect, grass tall, water clear, no visible hazard. Roy took off his hat and wiped his forehead. "Call the vet," Thomas said to Dr. Ellis arrived the next afternoon. He was a tall man who had treated Harlan cattle since Raymond's time. He drew blood, checked hooves, walked the pasture, tested the pond. After 4 hours, he sat with Thomas on the porch steps. "Everything's clean," Dr. Ellis said. "No fever, no parasites, no toxic plants, no heavy metals in the water. The grass is good. I can't find a thing wrong with them or the ground." "Then why won't they go in?" The vet shook his head. "I've been doing this 26 years. I've never seen a whole herd refuse a pasture that looks like that one. Not once." Thomas stared at the horizon. The vet drove away. The cattle stayed bunched in the other fields. Thomas Harlan stood on the porch long after Dr. Ellis's truck disappeared down the county road. The vet's words hung in the air like dust that wouldn't settle. No disease, no poison, no reason. Yet the cattle still refused the east pasture. They crowded the north and south fields, trampling the grass thin, while the best grazing on the ranch sat empty under a clear sky. He tried to force logic onto the problem. Maybe a snake den no one noticed. Maybe a faint chemical smell from old fence posts. Maybe the wind carried something from the highway miles away. He walked the ground himself the next morning, boots sinking into soft earth, looking for anything out of place. Nothing. The pasture smelled of sun-warmed grass and distant cedar. Clean. Perfect. The hands kept trying. Twice a day they gathered at the gate, horses sidestepping, voices low so the animals wouldn't spook worse. Roy led one group, Eddie another. They used gentle pressure first, then louder calls, then the rattle of empty feed buckets. A few head would edge forward, noses low, then jerk back as if they hit an invisible wall. One heifer bolted sideways and nearly crashed through barbed wire. After an hour, they gave up, faces red, shirts soaked. Thomas watched from the ridge. His jaw tightened. This wasn't how problems got solved on his ranch. Problems had causes. Causes had fixes. Clara stayed mostly in the house now. She tended her small herb patch behind the kitchen, but her movements were slower. The flowers on the porch steps, geraniums she had babied for years, drooped, petals browning at the edges. Thomas noticed, but said nothing. Supper that night was quiet. She ate little, pushed beans around her plate, then excused herself early. Friday evening she appeared in the kitchen doorway while Thomas finished his coffee. She stood with both hands on the frame, steady but small against the wide opening. "Your grandfather built that chapel so the Virgin Mary would protect this land," she said. Her voice was calm, almost flat. "He prayed there himself until the day he died. He believed she kept the wells full and the calves strong." Thomas set the mug down. "Mom, cattle don't know anything about chapels." Clara looked at him a long moment. "Maybe not, but the land remembers." She turned and walked back to her room. The door clicked shut softly, the phrase lodged in Thomas's mind like a splinter. He tried to work it loose with more fence posts and feed orders. By the end of the second week, the north and south pastures showed bare patches. He had to buy hay and supplemental cubes, expensive feed he had budgeted for winter, not July. Every sack hurt the bottom line. The hands talked among themselves when they thought he couldn't hear. Roy and Eddie stood by the barn one afternoon, cleaning tack. "Never seen stock act like that," Eddie said. "Not in 20 years. Roy grunted. "Chapel comes down. Pasture goes empty. You do the math." Thomas overheard. He walked over. "Something to say?" Roy met his eyes. "Just that the boys are wondering, boss. 3 weeks now, and not one animal crosses that line. Vet says nothing's wrong. We're wondering if maybe what?" Roy shrugged. "If maybe it ain't natural." Thomas stared him down. "Cattle don't pray, Roy. They eat. Something's spooking them. We'll find it." Roy nodded once and went back to the bridle. But his face stayed thoughtful. Thomas called another vet, Dr. Navarro from Lubbock, a specialist in herd behavior. The man spent 2 full days observing from blinds, running movement tests, even setting up trail cameras. Results came back the same. Healthy animals. Good forage. No stressors the equipment could detect. That night, Clara came to the kitchen again. Thomas sat alone with a plate of cold roast. She didn't sit. She stood near the table, arms folded. "It's not a coincidence," she said. 40 years that chapel stood there. Cattle grazed around it every season. You take it down, and 3 days later they won't set foot in the place. You can call it what you want. I call it a sign. Thomas looked up. "Signs don't pay the feed bill, Mom." Clara's eyes held steady. "Pride costs more than feed." She left without another word. The next afternoon, a neighbor, Wes Caldwell, who ran the spread 2 miles west, drove over to discuss a shared water line. They talked numbers on the tailgate of Wes's truck. Then Wes paused. "Saw your mama the other day," he said. "She was sitting right where the chapel used to be. Just her and the rosary, out in the sun. 83 years old, Thomas. Sitting on the bare ground." Thomas felt heat rise in his neck. He changed the subject to pipe sizes. Wes left soon after. That image stayed. Clara in her faded cotton dress, beads moving through her fingers, head bowed under the noon sun on ground that used to hold a roof. Thomas tried to push it away. He couldn't. The third week dragged. Feed costs climbed. Pastures were thinner. The hands moved quieter, eyes flicking toward the empty east field whenever they passed. Thomas kept looking too. Every morning he rode the ridge and stared at the open grass, the oaks, the nothing where the chapel had been. The unease grew heavier each day, a weight he carried in his chest and couldn't name that he still told himself it would pass. A smell would fade. A pattern would break. The cattle would forget. They didn't. Thomas Harlan lay awake that Tuesday night, staring at the ceiling cracks he had meant to patch for years. The clock in the living room ticked loud enough to fill the dark house. 3 o'clock came and went. Sleep refused to come. His mind kept circling the same ground. The empty pasture, the crowded fields, Clara's quiet words, the feed bills stacking on the desk. Nothing fit. Nothing made sense. He threw back the sheet, pulled on boots over bare feet, and stepped outside. The air was cool, stars sharp overhead. Crickets sang in the tall grass. He walked without thinking, boots crunching gravel, then dirt, following the familiar path that led past the north pasture toward the east. He didn't plan to go there. His legs just carried him. At the north gate, he stopped. The herd stood packed tight, heads down, quiet. No lowing, no shifting. They looked like statues carved from shadow. Thomas opened the gate, stepped through, and crossed into the east pasture. The grass brushed his knees, untouched for weeks. Moonlight silvered the blades. He kept walking until he reached the exact spot where the chapel foundation had been scraped clean. Only a faint rectangle of darker soil marked the place. He stood there. Wind moved through the live oaks, soft as breath. For the first time in years, he let himself remember. Elias in his old overalls, mixing mortar with a hoe, stacking brick after brick while Raymond, still a boy, handed him stones. Elias humming an old hymn under his breath. The day the roof went on, the whole family stood around, Clara holding a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked along the fence line. Elias set the statue inside with both hands, as careful as if it were alive. "She'll keep watch," he said, "long as we let her." Thomas thought of Clara walking that same path every day, rosary in hand, sitting on the bench Raymond built. Year after year. Rain, heat, nothing stopped her. He thought of her face at the kitchen window the morning the walls came down, eyes dry but empty. The curtain closing. The silence at supper after supper. The geraniums wilting because she forgot to water them. His throat tightened. He looked at the bare ground and felt the weight of it all pressed down at once. 40 years of quiet protection undone in half a day. Because of space. Because of numbers on paper. Because he thought he knew better. A scent came then. Roses, sudden and strong. Not faint. Not imagined. Full, sweet, the way fresh blooms smell after rain. There were no rose bushes on the ranch. Never had been. The fragrance wrapped around him, held for perhaps 10 seconds, then faded clean away. His knees buckled. He dropped to the ground, hands flat on the dirt, forehead almost touching the soil. His breath came ragged. He didn't know the words for prayer. He had never learned them. But something came out anyway, low and broken. "I shouldn't have done it." The words scraped his throat. Tears followed, hot, fast, the kind he hadn't shed since Raymond's funeral. He cried for the pride that made him deaf to his mother's plea, for the chapel reduced to rubble, for the hurt he caused Clara without once looking back, for thinking a statue and a few bricks didn't matter to the land or to the people who lived on it. He stayed on his knees a long time. The sky began to pale at the edges. His legs went numb. When he finally stood, the east pasture looked different, not changed, but seen. He walked back to the house slowly, boots heavy, porch lights still burning. Inside, he took off his boots, moved quiet so he wouldn't wake Clara. He sat in the living room until full light came through the windows. Clara appeared in her robe, hair still braided for sleep. She carried her Bible. She saw him sitting there, hands loose on his knees, eyes on the floor. She didn't speak first. Thomas looked up. "Mom, I'm going to rebuild the chapel." Clara paused. She closed the Bible slowly, set it on the side table next to the statue of Our Lady. "Right where it was," he said. "Same size, same materials. I'll move the expansion to the west side instead. We'll make it work." Clara studied his face. Lines she knew by heart now looked different, drawn, softer somehow. "You heard me?" he asked. "I heard. You're not going to say anything?" "What do you want me to say, Thomas?" He had no answer. He had expected, maybe, relief or forgiveness spoken out loud, or even anger. Clara gave none of those. She simply asked, "When do you start?" "This week. I'll call the mason." She nodded once. "Okay." She opened the Bible again and sat in her chair. Thomas stayed a moment longer, then stood and walked out to the porch. The morning was already warm. He breathed deep. For the first time in weeks, the tightness in his chest eased, just a little. Word moved fast on a ranch. By noon, Roy knew. He found Thomas checking water in the north pasture. "Boss, is it true? You're putting the chapel back up?" Thomas straightened. "It's true." Roy looked at him steady. "Good call." Thomas only nodded. Roy touched the brim of his hat and walked on. That same day, Thomas phoned Dale Whitaker, a mason from town who had built barns and chimneys for half the county. Thomas explained what he wanted. Brick and stone, same footprint, same simple lines. Dale listened, asked measurements, quoted a price that Thomas accepted without bargaining. Work would start Monday. Thomas hung up the phone and looked toward the east pasture. The grass still stood tall. The cattle still stayed away. But something had shifted inside the man who owned the land. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. The work began on Monday, just as Dale Whitaker promised. He arrived in a battered pickup with his nephew riding shotgun, both men carrying tool belts and quiet confidence. Dale was in his late 50s, hands scarred from decades of trowel and mortar. He had built the stone fireplace in the county courthouse and half the porches in town. Thomas met him at the east pasture gate, handed over the sketched measurements, and pointed to the cleared rectangle of soil. Same as before, Thomas said. Brick base, stone walls to the window line, simple roof. No frills. Dale walked the ground, paced it off, checked the level with a long board. We'll pour a new footer today. Should be up in 2 weeks if the weather holds. Thomas nodded. I want it solid. Like it was. The first days moved slow and steady. Dale and his nephew leveled the site, dug trenches, mixed concrete in a rented mixer that coughed gray dust across the grass. The hands watched from a distance during breaks. Roy leaned on a fence post one afternoon, arms folded. Think they'll come back once the walls go up? Eddie asked beside him. Roy shrugged. Don't know, but the boss is different. Quieter. Looks at that spot like it owes him something. Thomas kept his routine, morning rounds, fence checks, feed orders, but he passed the construction site more often than necessary. He never lingered long. Just looked, then moved on. Clara stayed in the house most of those first days. She watered the geraniums again, pulled weeds from the herb bed, started cooking supper earlier so the kitchen smelled of onions and chili by 4 o'clock. Thomas noticed the change, but said nothing. Small things felt louder now. On the fourth morning of work, Roy rode up to the house at first light. He found Thomas on the porch with coffee. Boss, you better see this. Thomas followed him on foot. At the east pasture gate, a single cow stood inside, head down, grazing calm as if she had never left. She was one of the older Herefords, steady temperament, no reason to be the first. The rest of the herd still bunched in the north field. Watching, Thomas stared. When did she go in? Sometime in the night. Found her when I checked water. She's been eating steady since sunup. Thomas walked closer. The cow lifted her head, looked at him, then dropped it back to the grass. No hesitation. No freeze. Could be coincidence, he said. Roy scratched his jaw. Could be. Neither believed it. The next day, 2 more crossed the line, young heifers following the older cow's path. They grazed near the foundation, tails switching flies. By the end of the week, 5 head were inside regularly, then 8, then a dozen. They moved in slow groups, testing, pausing at the gate, then stepping through like they remembered the place. Dale's walls rose, brick to knee height, then stone layered above. The men worked with rhythm, trowel slap, stone set, level check. Thomas supplied water jugs and cold drinks without being asked. One afternoon, he carried a case of bottled water to the site himself. Dale wiped sweat from his brow. Appreciate it. This heat's mean. Thomas looked at the rising structure. Make it last. Clara began walking out again. On the 8th day of construction, Thomas saw her from the ridge, small figure in a wide straw hat, moving slow along the path to the east pasture. She stopped at the edge of the work zone, hands clasped, watching Dale fit a lintel stone over the future window. She didn't speak. She just stood there a long minute, then turned back toward the house. That evening at supper, she spoke first. Dale does careful work. You can tell he respects the stone. Thomas looked across the table. Yeah, he's good. Clara cut a piece of cornbread, set it on his plate. That's all. It was the first real sentence between them in weeks that wasn't about weather or chores. Thomas felt the air in the room loosen, just enough to breathe. The second week, the chapel took shape. Walls reached shoulder height. Dale framed the roof trusses. The herd kept returning. 20 head, then 40, then more than half. They spread out across the pasture again, grazing in the familiar patterns, calves kicking up dust near the oaks. The north and south fields eased their crowding. Grass began to recover. Thomas watched it happen every morning. He rode the perimeter, counted heads, noted which animals led and which followed. No one spoke the obvious aloud, but the hands moved lighter. Smiles came easier. Dale finished the roof on a Friday. Metal sheets screwed down tight, edges trimmed clean. The chapel stood simple and strong. Brick base, stone walls, pitched roof catching the late sun. Dale stepped back, hands on hips. "Looks right," he said. "Should stand another 40 years easy." Thomas shook his hand. "Thank you." That evening, Thomas went to Clara's room. She sat in her chair, Bible open on her lap, the plaster statue of Our Lady beside her on the small table. "It's done," he said. Clara looked up. She closed the book slowly, stood, and lifted the statue with both hands. She carried it to him and placed it in his palms. Her fingers were cool and steady. Her eyes held something peaceful Thomas hadn't seen in a long time, that he carried the statue across the pasture in the last light. Dale had already cleaned the interior, floor swept, shelf dusted. Thomas set the figure in its old place, adjusted it once, stepped back. The serene face looked out over the grass as though nothing had ever changed. Roy passed by on horseback just then. He saw Thomas standing in the open doorway, hat in hand. Roy reined up, removed his own hat, made the sign of the cross, then rode on without a word. By the end of that week, the entire herd had returned to the east pasture. Every animal. They grazed normally, calves bawling, tails high. The refusal of 3 weeks earlier seemed like a dream no one quite believed anymore. Thomas stood at the gate one evening and watched them spread across the green. The chapel sat quiet in the middle, small and certain. The months rolled on after the chapel stood complete again. Thomas Harlan expanded the ranch as he had planned, but on the west side now. New cross fences, additional water lines, another 100 acres opened for grazing. The numbers worked out. The herd grew steady, calves born strong, market weight solid. The east pasture stayed green and open, the cattle spreading across it like they always had. No memory of the weeks they refused it. Thomas didn't change overnight into someone else. He still rose before dawn, still checked troughs and counted head, still studied price sheets at the kitchen table with a pencil behind his ear. He didn't start driving into town for daily mass or carrying a rosary in his pocket. He never told the story to strangers or even to most neighbors. Some things stay between a man, his land, and the quiet. He learned to listen to point. One habit appeared without announcement. Late afternoons, after the day's work ended and the hands had gone home, Thomas would ride or walk past the chapel. Sometimes he kept moving, glancing over as he passed. Other times he stopped at the open doorway, removed his hat, and stood looking at the plaster statue of Our Lady. Her hands still open, her face unchanged. He never spoke aloud. He just stood there a minute or two, breathing the same air the oaks breathed, then turned back toward the house. Clara returned to her routine fully. She walked the path to the chapel most days, rosary in hand, sat on the new wooden bench Thomas had asked Dale to make. Simple oak, same height and width as the one Raymond built long ago. She prayed bead by bead, eyes closed, lips moving softly. Sometimes in the cool of morning, sometimes when the sun hung low and gold over the pasture. They ate supper together again every night. The table felt less empty. Conversation stayed small. Cattle prices, fence repairs, whether rain would come before the next cutting of hay. But the silences between sentences carried less weight. One evening in early autumn, after plates were cleared and coffee poured, Clara spoke without looking up from her cup. "Your father would be proud." Thomas paused, fork halfway to his mouth. "Proud of what?" "Of you fixing what needed fixing." He set the fork down, looked at her across the table. Clara met his eyes, steady as always that he nodded once. "I hope so." She smiled, just a small turn of her lips, then sipped her coffee. One afternoon in late October, Clara walked to the chapel as usual. The air carried the first bite of fall. She stepped inside and stopped. Thomas was already there, sitting on the bench, elbows on knees, hands clasped loose, staring at the statue. He didn't turn when she entered. She moved quietly, sat beside him on the narrow wood. Neither spoke. The sun dropped behind the live oaks, stretching long shadows across the grass. Cattle grazed in the distance, low balls drifting on the breeze. Mother and son sat side by side in the small quiet space, watching light fade from gold to rose to gray. No words passed. None were needed. The presence was enough. This day, no one has explained why the cattle refused the east pasture for those 3 weeks. Veterinarians shook their heads. Neighbors offered opinions, some practical, some whispered about signs and protection. Thomas never added his voice to the talk. He kept the memory of that dawn kneeling in the dirt, the sudden scent of roses, the raw admission that broke from his chest. Those moments don't fit into conversations over coffee or fence lines. They live deeper, where words can't reach. The chapel remains in the same place. Brick and stone, simple lines, the same plaster image of the Virgin Mary looking out with the same calm gaze. The land around it produces. The family on it endures. And every day, in ways large and small, the quiet protection continues. Before I close this story, I want to invite you to something special. If the tenderness and power of Our Lady have touched you through Thomas and Clara's journey, come join our prayer community. People from every corner of the world gather here to pray the rosary together, share intentions, and support one another in faith. Click the button below to become a channel member and pray with us. Your presence strengthens the chain. And if this account reached something in your heart, do one small thing for me. In the comments, write the word chapel. Just that. The word that once stood in brick and stone and later in a man's conscience. Every time I see it, I'll know one more person believes these quiet miracles still happen. That if you've witnessed or received a grace from the Virgin Mary, big or small, share it below. Your story could be the hope someone else needs today. Pass this along to a friend who could use a reminder that no decision is final when heaven is involved. May Our Lady of Grace continue to watch over you, your family, and your land, whatever shape that land takes in your life.